Welcome back to the shop. There are two main ways to make knives. The first is forging, which is what I do most of the time, in which you heat up the steel and then hit it with a hammer to forge the shape that you want. The second is called stock removal, and like many knife makers, I started with stock removal. Stock removal is where you take a large piece of steel and then you grind or cut away whatever material you don't need until you're left with a final shape. And while I still use stock removal for small things like carving knives and marking knives, it's been a very long time since I made a big knife with stock removal. So that is what I'm going to do today. I've got a piece of 1.5" by 3/8 80 CRV2 steel that I have a design drawn out on, and today I'm going to make this knife from stock removal. Both stock removal and forging are equally valid ways of making knives, but they each have their own pros and cons. With stock removal, there's no need for surface grinding or anything because the billet's already flat when you start working on it. And it also requires less skills to learn. There's no forging involved, so you don't have to learn the forging skills, you only have to learn the grinding skills and the fit and finish skills. It also requires a lot less tools. Basically, the only things you need to make a knife with stock removal are a file and a drill. All of these other tools do the same jobs as those tools, just faster. But that's all you really need. It also requires less space, and it makes a lot less noise. And when you're heat treating, there's no need for thermocycling or annealing because there are no stresses introduced into the blade as there would be from forging. So heat treatment is a lot easier with stock removal. And it's a really great way to get involved in knife making if you have no prior experience. On the other hand, there is a lot more material wastage involved when you are making a knife through stock removal, because you have to grind away everything that is not the profile of the blade. Whereas with forging, you would simply forge the blade to shape and there would be a lot less grinding involved. So you get more bang for your buck out of your steel when you're forging. Another con of stock removal is that it's just not really as fun as forging, but it is still a lot of fun. Also, stock removal requires less skill, and so it's less challenging than forging. So while it's a great way to get started, it's not as great if you want to build your skills. There's also the fact that the American Bladesmithing Society will not allow a stock removal knife maker to earn the Master Bladesmith rating. You can get to the Journeyman rating, but you're pretty much capped there unless you learn how to forge knives as well. And that's kind of the benefit of forging knives as well. You save a lot of material, and you can become an ABS mastersmith if you get good enough, and there's always room for growth when you're forging. There's always going to be new challenges, new skills to learn, and that's something you don't see as much with stock removal. That being said, forging does take a lot longer because there are more processes involved. And there's quite a learning curve to the skills of forging as well. And it requires more tools and more space, and it makes a lot more noise. But stock removal versus forging is really at the heart of the distinction between what makes a knife maker versus what makes a bladesmith. All bladesmiths are knife makers, but not all knife makers are bladesmiths. Bladesmithing is a specialization of blacksmithing, one that's focused on bladed weapons and or tools. So at the same time, all bladesmiths are blacksmiths, but not all blacksmiths are bladesmiths. This isn't to say that one is better than the other. There are many excellent knife makers who never even pick up a hammer and hit hot steel, and there are also many excellent blacksmiths that never make knives. So bladesmithing is really a convergence of the two worlds and a specialization in either one of them. Personally, I started blacksmithing before I started making knives, and even then, my first 6 knives were all made through stock removal, so I wasn't really a bladesmith. It wasn't until after a few months that I forged my first blade and started pursuing bladesmithing as well. But even now, as I'm mainly pursuing bladesmithing, I still enjoy small blacksmithing projects that have nothing to do with knives, like keychains, tools, and belt buckles. And even though I'm bladesmithing, I still use stock removal sometimes for small things, or even for this. Overall, I do prefer forging blades, but stock removal has its place in my heart as well. Overall, I can't say that one is better than the other or easier than the other. Assuming you're decent at forging and decent at stock removal, everything that really matters to make the blade better happens during the fit and finish stage anyway. The last 10% of the work on a knife usually takes longer than the first 90%. Forging a knife or grinding out a profile really only takes an hour or two at most, but proper fit and finish takes way longer. I always say the difference between a good knife and a bad knife is about 10 hours of work, but that's really an understatement. On some of my knives, I've spent longer than that on some of the fine details. So overall, whether you're making knives through stock removal or forging out your blades, the only thing that really matters is your attention to detail and your willingness to spend long amounts of time to get the details perfect. Method is secondary, dedication is what really matters. Another aspect of knife making or bladesmithing that really makes a difference is the design phase. This particular knife started in the design phase very different from what it is now. I messed around with the curves, with the profile a lot until I got them exactly how I wanted them. Originally I thought I would do flat ground bevels with plunge lines taken all the way up to the spine, but then I changed it to a hollow grind with bevels taken halfway up the spine. And originally I thought that I would use small frame pins around the entire profile of the handle, and then I decided to use 3 Corby bolts instead. And after that I remembered that I had some 3/8 inch hollow pins as well, so I changed it to that after that. Then after drilling the 3 pinholes, the drill bit wandered off of my center punch marking on the middle hole, and it ended up going a little bit off center towards the front. So in order to avoid having misspaced pins, I changed the design again, and now I'm only going to be using the 2 front and back pins instead of the middle hole. So this middle hole is going to serve as kind of an epoxy bridge between the 2 scales now. Even the handle material changed in the design phase. I was originally planning on only using this ironwood, but then I decided to throw some red G10 spacers in there as well, kind of sandwiched between the blade itself and the handle scales. I think that'll add a nice little highlight to this handle. When you're working on things like knives, designs change pretty often, and that's okay, but design remains one of the most important parts of knife making because no matter what, you have to have a clear idea of what you're making, or else there won't be any intentionality to your creative decisions. So if I could summarize my point, I guess it would be that in any creative process, method and medium do not matter so much as your dedication and your intentionality in your craft. You need to be willing to put in some effort, and that effort needs to be guided in a clear direction. And when you have those 2 things, the difference will be evident in your work. And so I'm going to go ahead and put some of that dedication to work as I spend hours hand sanding this blade from 220 grit all the way up to 800 grit. you.